All right, everybody. How are we doing today? So nice to see you in person, and we welcome our streaming audience as well, but happy to have people back in the Farley Auditorium for Food for Thought. I'm Scotty Kirkland. I'm the Exhibits, Publications, and Programs Coordinator. I have just a couple of quick announcements for you. I want to make sure that when you leave, you grab a copy of our Food for Thought schedule. We still have 5 really good presentations coming up for the rest of this year, third Thursday of every month. For the last 31 years, this is the place to be. So I invite you to pick up that schedule. On Saturday, this Saturday, July 17th, we are going to have what we are billing as a grand reopening of our museum store. One of the things that happened here when we were closed to the public during the pandemic was that we were able to sort of reimagine, rethink our physical museum store and create a new online store called Alabama Original. So on Saturday, all day long, the archives is open, the museum is going to be open, and we're going to have a lot of special programs. All day long, there'll be 15% off all the merchandise in the store, and there are more books in the store. There are a lot more products made by Alabama artisans. There's just, if you haven't been in the store yet, encourage you to go by today or come back with your family on Saturday. So there'll be some material available for you to do, some educational material for kids. The hands-on gallery is reopened. There'll be activities all day for our kids. We'll have authors all day long, different book signings. At 11 o'clock, we have the author and illustrator of a new book called Sydney Tours Eufaula. This is a children's book that shows a architectural and history tour of the city of Eufaula. And the author and the illustrator will both be here, as will Sydney the dog. So this is a big week for animals in the archives. We're having a snake. We're going to have a dog. They're obviously not here on the same day, we're happy to say. And then at 1 o'clock, we'll have Carol King, who's the author of the Alabama Quilt book, who you may remember did a program for us back in March. And at 2 o'clock, we'll have Dan Hallman and Joe Caver, who are 2 of the contributors to an illustrated history of the Tuskegee Airmen, and who both have other books in their own right. And they'll sign all those books on Saturday. And Joe Caver will be here in November for our November Food for Thought, talking about the early years of Alabama State University. So we're very excited about Saturday's grand reopening, and we hope that you'll come back and join us. Our Food for Thought on August the 19th is a special presentation by Paul Pruitt from the University of Alabama Law Library. Dr. Pruitt is one of the experts on Julia Tutwiler, and he will be talking about her career as a social reformer here in Alabama on August the 19th. That's just a few days later, on August 22nd, we are going to open our long-delayed, COVID-delayed women's suffrage exhibit called Justice Not Favor, Alabama Women in the Vote. We're very excited about this. This will be a full exhibit on our second floor in the Changing Gallery that will open on Sunday afternoon, August the 22nd. On that same day, at 2 o'clock, we'll have a dedication ceremony for 2 new pieces of statuary that will go in our South Lobby, Alabama Statuary Hall. The first additions to that area in 3 decades. These will be the dedication of 2 new busts of Alabama women, early 20th century suffragists and a post-World War II century suffragist. So we're very excited about the opportunity to unveil these 2 new pieces. There'll be a lot going on that day, so you'll want to mark August the 22nd on your calendars. Jimmy Stiles is our guest today, and he is a doctoral candidate at Auburn University School of Forestry and Wildlife Services. He's been involved in the reintroduction of our eastern indigo snakes to Alabama since that project began about 13 years ago. He's also spent the last 18 years studying reptile and amphibian ecology in our longleaf pine ecosystem. So you can tell there is a special guest with us today. We're very excited about that. I will not introduce the snake. I've been asked not to do that. Our special guest will come out at the end of the program. So what we'll do, Jimmy will do his presentation. We will have time for Q&A. And then at the end, anyone who wants to stay to interact with the snake is welcome to come up and do so, perfectly safe. Those of you who do not want to do that, you will still experience the full presentation, and then you can go out the back door where I will be standing. So insert your own snake jokes here. We're going to skip all that and just invite Jimmy to come up and share with us. Thanks.
Thank you for having me. So what I want to do today is to take you on a little journey and tell you about the reintroduction of the eastern indigo snake into Alabama. The eastern indigo snake is kind of an iconic species that we have in Alabama. It's the largest native snake to the United States. And unfortunately, this snake was lost to our southern Alabama counties where it occurred somewhere around the 1950s to 60s. And lots of reasons led to that loss. But rather than telling you about all the terrible things that happen to indigo snakes, I'm going to spend the next 30, 45 minutes telling you about how we are now trying to bring it back to our state. So I do work for Auburn University. I'm a PhD student there at Auburn. But most of what I'm going to talk about is what I did for my master's degree several years ago. And then fast forward all the way up to today. If I can get. Well, I think I might have hit the wrong button. We might have encountered our first technological problem of the day. Let's see if I can. And let's see if this will work. Slide. Oh, I think I might have to make that go away. All right. Now, let's see if we can do this. Magic. Hopefully it will work now. I believe so. All right. I'm going to go back to the title. Yep. All right. And now we're going to go forward in time, but back in time all at the same time. Also, being this in archives, I want to tell you a little bit about the history of indigo reintroductions, both in the United States and in Alabama. So featured here in this picture is Dr. Dan Speak, formerly with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Cooperative Unit at Auburn. Dan is the godfather of indigo snakes. He started trying to reintroduce indigo snakes all across the southeastern United States in the 1980s. And he was kind of like the Johnny Appleseed of indigo snakes. So what Dr. Speak would do would be to raise up some indigo snakes, breed them in the lab at Auburn, and then he would basically just go around all over the southeastern United States, throwing some snakes here and throwing some snakes there, just kind of sprinkling indigo snakes all across the landscape. How I got involved with this project was back in, I guess, 2004. We wanted to do a survey and to look to see if any of these efforts done by Dr. Speak were successful in establishing any sort of populations. So we went to all of the sites that Dr. Speak did this at, and we surveyed for indigo snakes. And we looked and we looked, and we could not find any indigo snakes. And we deemed that his efforts were largely unsuccessful at establishing a viable population or a self-sustaining population of indigo snakes. Luckily, Dr. Speak was alive at the time, and we'll fast forward a little bit. And these two guys here, Jim Godwin and Mark Sasser, got together and with some money that Mr. Sasser had with the ADC&R, we said, well, we'd like to try and reintroduce indigo snakes and do it right and establish a viable population. So we got Dr. Speak involved, and we kind of all talked to see if we could come up and formulate a plan to do this successful reintroduction project. And we highlighted, maybe some of the areas where Dr. Speak went wrong, and then, try to figure out some ways that we could adapt what he did and advance that a little bit to then create a viable population. And a couple of the things that we hit on was one, instead of just taking a few snakes and throwing them lots of different places, we're going to take a whole bunch of snakes and we're going to throw them in one place. So we had to figure that out. And so this project, any sort of project of this size is not done by one or two people or even one or two agencies. It's a very extensive project, has a lot of different partners, a lot of different organizations that all come together and to make this happen. So it started originally with Auburn University and the Department of Conservation here in Alabama, but quickly, we needed snakes, and indigo snakes are listed as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. So that requires both permits and permission and all the good graces of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So they provide us permits for all the different projects, as well as logistical support, et cetera. And then we had to find a place to put them. We picked the Conecuh National Forest in southern Alabama. So automatically that involves the United States Forest Service, since we're putting a federally protected species onto federal ground. So we had to rope in the Forest Service. And I'll talk more about where we got the snakes to begin with, but our original snakes came from Georgia, where there's still an extant population of indigo snakes. So we went over there and stole some of their potential snakes. Again, we had to have them involved. And then a cool organization appeared on the scene about the time we started doing this project, a couple of years after we started, called the Orion Society. It's a nonprofit organization that's focused on reptile and amphibian conservation. And they provided a lot of monetary and technical assistance that I'll talk about later. And then Zoo Atlanta quickly became involved because of what we were doing. We're taking these snakes, we're hatching them out. But then we have lots and lots of snakes that somebody has to scoop all the poop and feed them all the time. And it became quite a chore for us at Auburn to be able to do that. That was one of the things I started doing, and it was quickly quite overwhelming. So Zoo Atlanta stepped up and said, hey, why don't y'all hatch them and then you give them to us. We'll take care of them until y'all are ready to release them. We said, that's an awesome idea. So they became involved in the husbandry. And then, as I'll talk about in a little bit, it became important that we not take snakes out of the wild and that we start producing snakes. So we established a captive breeding program, which is now run by the Central Florida Zoo at what is called the Orion Center for Indigo Conservation. So they are in charge of all of our captive breeding programs. So the way we kind of got started and the way we did things was, like I said, we had to pick a release site. So we picked the Conecuh National Forest down in southern Alabama. And there's a couple reasons we picked it. One of the biggest reasons, and don't get too caught up in this big jumbled map here, but I do want you to notice that there's this giant green blob. These green blobs represent longleaf pine ecosystem that's still left in the world. Longleaf pine was a dominant feature of our landscapes here in the Southeast, but has been rapidly declining. And it is also the ecosystem for which the indigo snakes are native to. So we need good longleaf pine habitat. And it just so happens in southern Alabama, the Conecuh National Forest and the adjacent forests down in Florida comprise the largest amount of longleaf ecosystem left in the world. So, hey, makes a great place to let some snakes go. So then we had to go get snakes because, well, you got to have snakes to let snakes go. So what we did, we went over to Georgia, and this is a friend of mine, Dirk Stevenson. We went over to Georgia where there's still gravid indigo snakes, and we basically just scooped up a bunch of indigo snakes, as you can see here. These are what indigo snakes look like, especially when I don't know how many he's got. He's got 3 or 4 indigo snakes on him. But Dirk would go out, grab up these snakes, and we would take them back to Auburn. And Auburn, we would let the snakes lay their eggs. The females would actually go directly back where we caught them to the exact location. And then we kept the eggs. We reared the eggs, and we got them to hatch out. And then I'll talk more about this in a little bit, but we held back 1 or 2 snakes from each clutch of eggs for the captive breeding program, because we realized that taking snakes, potential wild snakes, out of one of the last strong indigo snake populations was not sustainable. It was not good for the Georgia populations. So we needed a captive breeding program. We needed indigo snakes that were physiologically adapted to where we're going to release them. So we decided we'd start a captive breeding program. So we held back a few snakes. The remaining snakes, we raised them for 2 years. And then right before the release, we built these big crazy tanks out at Auburn that we called the acclimation tubs. And at about 2 or 3 months before we were due to release the snakes, we put them in these giant tubs, which basically consisted of, some sand, some pine straw from the actual release site. We'd give them live prey from the release site. And they also had indigo snakes spend a lot of time underground. So we created these artificial cavities where the indigo snake could go down underground and start exploring their territories. Before this point, they were just raised in plastic tubs. So then, like I said, it wasn't very viable to keep stealing these snakes from the wild. So we created this captive breeding colony, which is now down, like I said, at the Orion Center for Indigo Conservation, which is down in Florida, run by the Central Florida Zoo. They now produce all of the little baby snakes. Those little baby snakes then go to Zoo Atlanta, to an even nicer facility. This was our original facility. I haven't been to the new rearing facility that they have there, but they basically go spend 2 years to get big enough so that they're not basically just like an M&M for everything that likes to eat creatures out in the forest. We want them to be big and healthy before we release them. So that's how we do things now. We'll back up just a smidgen. And one of the things I did, the main thing I did my master's research on, my wife as well, was we want to know when we reintroduce an animal, there's some really important scientific things we need to know. And one of the best ways to gather that information is to do radio telemetry, to basically follow these snakes that we release through the woods so we can answer basic questions about their biology. Are they surviving? Are they, how big an area are they using? Are they staying within the Kanaka National Forest? And what kind of habitats are they using? Are they using habitats similarly to, the wild indigo snakes? So we want to know all those things, and basically the best way to get that information is to implant them with radio transmitters. This is what the radio transmitters look like, and we would surgically implant them inside the body cavity of the snake, and they have this big long antenna that goes down the length of the snake. So we would implant them with these radio transmitters and then release them into the wild and follow them around, see what they do. there's a little bit of a delay. So we released the snakes, and one of the first things we did, again, we're just trying to do things out of the box. And so we released the original clutches of snakes into these big enclosures. So basically fenced off a 12-acre area of forest, subdivided it to make different little pens, and then set a lot of the snakes, or half the snakes, I should say, in the enclosures, and we set half of them outside the enclosures to do a study to see if using enclosures like this would benefit the reintroduction. It's very similar to other reintroductions of other animals, such as birds and mammals, both of which have used this technique called a soft release. And that's one of the things I focused on my master's research on. So obviously one of the things that's real important is the amount of area that the snakes are using. So this is 1 year's telemetry data. This is 2 years telemetry data. You can see we got lots of little dots up there. We figured out that they were using a pretty large area, about 3,000 hectares or 8,000 acres. So they're utilizing a pretty big chunk of ground. And so, like I said, one of the things that we really want to know is, are these snakes acting like wild snakes? You know, if you're reintroducing a snake, you want it to be doing things that wild snakes do. And so we compared our home ranges, the area that our snakes were using over here, to all the other known wild snake home range sizes. And as you can see, ours kind of fit in the middle. In fact, there's one, this study was actually done at the site where we got the original snakes from. So they're using an even smaller area than that, and comparable to all the other wild snakes. This is good, right? This means that our snakes are kind of staying in the same sort of area, and they're not basically just, when we dump them on the ground, they're not shooting off and just disappearing, because that happens a lot with reintroductions. So another thing that I kind of wanted to look at is male-female overlaps. So to make more indigo snakes, you kind of need the males and the females to hang out in the same area. That's what makes other snakes. And so we looked at that. Turns out that this idea of the enclosures was a pretty good idea, because the males that stayed in the enclosures overlapped the home ranges of more female snakes than did the ones that we just threw outside the enclosures. So using the enclosures was probably a good idea. Again, another sort of thing, the more time that a male spent inside the enclosures, the more likely, once it got outside the enclosures, to hang out with female snakes. Again, that's a good thing for making more indigo snakes. So we felt like the enclosures were doing a pretty good job. Another important thing that we need to look at is survival, right? If we throw all the snakes out there in the woods and then they all immediately die, well, it's not a very successful reintroduction. So we looked at survival, and it turns out that on average, our snakes about 50% survival the first year. So 50% of the snakes, and this is early on, our survival estimates have increased. But in the first year, we throw them out, about half of them die. Most of them are killed by hawks and owls. A few of them were run over by cars. And then just natural disease got a couple of them. But still, 50% the first year for any reintroduction project is actually a pretty high number. Seems kind of low. But if they made it through the first year, our survival estimates were up up towards 80 to 90% for each subsequent year. So if they live the first year, their chances of living are pretty rock solid. So we felt like they're surviving. That's pretty awesome. And don't get too caught up in all the numbers here, the nerdy science stuff. But basically, we figured out that survival was determined by a couple of things. One is whether they were male or females. Male snakes were kind of stupid and they died a lot. Female snakes were pretty smart and they lived a lot more than the males. The driving factors of that was home range. So the larger their home range, the more they died. Male snakes, one of the reasons they died more than females was they had larger home range sizes because they're out there trying to explore and find female snakes. And then also, as it turns out, the distance they moved is a very important factor as well. The further you move away from the release site, the more likely you are to encounter something that's going to kill you. So, but again, all of our estimates kind of showed that, you know, survival was not a big problem. If we threw snakes out there, they didn't just all die. So one of the things my wife did her master's research on was looking at habitat use by the snakes and to see if that habitat use mirrored that of wild snakes. So again, it's fuzzy and you're like, I can't read anything. You don't have to. All you got to see on this slide is that this graph looks remarkably similar to this graph, right? This is wild snakes and this is our reintroduced snakes. So they use habitat very similarly to the wild indigo snakes. In fact, it kind of turns out that indigo snakes are innate sort of creatures. Once you throw them out in the woods, they know what to do. They act just like they should, you know, even though they were reared for the first 2 years of their life in a little plastic box. So again, we also want to look at shelter. So indigo snakes require shelter out in the forest, basically holes in the ground. And so we wanted to look at the use of those holes. Again, you don't have to look too detailed into all of those graphs, but notice that the graphs are very similar, right? And that if you notice here and here, over here on the far right-hand side of, or left-hand side of each graph is gopher tortoises. Indigo snakes are intimately tied with gopher tortoises and use gopher tortoise burrows in the winter almost exclusively. So we found that our indigo snakes that we're reintroducing use gopher tortoise burrows and other refugia very similarly to wild indigo snakes. Another great sign that the project is, you know, on the right track. So another important part of a reintroduction project is teaching people why we should do reintroduction projects and why we should put these snakes back out into the forest. And so one of the things that Sierra and I do a lot of is educational programs all around the area. We do it for, you know, incredibly academic types and the people that run the little country store by us. We don't care who you are. We'll try and convince you that indigo snakes are cool and that we should reintroduce them back out into the forest. Well, I guess my presence here today says that continues to be a very important part of the project. So kind of what we've learned so far and what we're using to continue our project. Partnerships are key. In fact, we're trying to continually add partnerships to the project as we move forward. Using the enclosures, turns out pretty awesome idea. Now it turns out indigo snakes are incredibly social creatures. So using the enclosures was really important for the first couple years. But once there are enough indigo snakes out there leaving scent trails for other indigo snakes to follow, you don't really need the enclosures. You've got some snakes out there. Snakes are slithering around. They can contact them. So really important for the first couple years. But then this all started in 2010. So we actually, by 2013, had taken down the enclosures. Now we just release snakes out into the woods. They seem to contact each other just fine. Survival is good. Our indigo snakes are surviving. That's pretty awesome. And building populations. I'll tell more about that in a second. And that the home ranges, habitats, and shelters mirror that of wild populations. All great signs that we're on the path to success. And of course, educating the public is always important, right? If you don't have public buy-in, especially local buy-in from the people that live right around the forest where we're putting out snakes, you know, they're just going to kill everyone they see, etc. So getting that local buy-in is really important. We've definitely gotten that. Everybody around the release site, I mean, they have literally gotten out in traffic and stopped cars to let an indigo snake cross the road, which is pretty awesome. So what we're doing now, that was kind of the first few years we're focused on figuring out if the project was on a good trajectory. But now we kind of want to know some other cool sciencey ecological questions. One is, how are indigo snakes? Indigo snakes are an apex predator. They prefer to eat other snakes, including venomous snakes like rattlesnakes, copperheads, cottonmouths, all that sort of stuff. But they will also eat other snakes, such as gray rat snakes. Gray rat snakes are a very important predator of birds and small mammals. So, you know, how many of y'all out there in the audience have heard of the Yellowstone wolves and the reintroduction of Yellowstone wolves? A few of those, right? A few of y'all, right? Well, it turns out that reintroducing the apex predator wolves had all kinds of ecological effects, all the way down to, you know, putting wolves out affected the grass along, you know, creeks and streams in Yellowstone National Park. Well, we wanted to know, if we release indigo snakes, what kind of bigger ecological effects is that having on the national forest? Is it affecting songbirds? So we're currently wrapping up a study where we looked at songbird and nest predation. You know, again, kind of the opposite. The indigos don't eat birds, but they eat one of the major predators of birds. Same with mice and rats. So we looked at small mammals. And the way we did that is by using these big snake traps to catch reptile and amphibian species, to again look at are indigo snakes affecting the assemblages of other snake species out there in the forest. We're just kind of wrapping that up. In fact, we just got done last week taking out all of these big fences. We're doing the data analysis now. So I can't give you the actual answers right now, but we are working on it. So another thing that we're doing right now is monitoring the reintroduction. So we want to know, are the snakes that we put out there, are they building a viable population? Because remember, that was the original goal, to build a viable population. Well, to know that, we have to kind of be able to tell you what the population is, right? So that's one of the things that we're actively doing right now, is monitoring. So we go out in the winter time, often after prescribed fires. You can see this relatively desolate landscape. If I showed you a picture of that field right now, it's like that tall with blackberries and all kinds of crazy stuff. But we go out after the prescribed fires and We target gopher tortoise sparrows in the wintertime, and we can find indigo snakes out basking and using those as well. As we've started recently, there's a master's student at Auburn University now, Francesca Erickson, who is using game cameras to monitor gopher tortoise sparrows. Since we can't be out there all the time, it's very labor intensive to just wander around in the woods looking for snakes. Our detection's not great. I mean, it's a cool job. Hey, I just wander around. That's what I did for a couple of years. I walked 15 miles every single day, just through the woods, doing transects, looking for snakes. They were like, why are we paying to me to do this when there's cameras? So now we just go stick cameras on gopher tortoise sparrows, and then Francesca's created a cool AI algorithm that basically looks at the camera image and it filters out snakes are ectotherms, right? They don't produce their own heat. So a typical game camera is triggered by heat passing through it. It's an infrared sensor. Snakes don't trigger that very well. So what she does is she sets the camera to take a picture every, I think it's 30 seconds. Well, that really quickly starts adding up to millions of pictures that you have to look through. So she created an AI platform that basically scans all of those pictures and only flags the ones where something is different, such as there being a snake in the frame. That's allowed us to monitor these snakes without me having to walk, hundreds of miles every year, and without having to have somebody sit there at a computer for hours and hours on end. So it's pretty awesome and effective technology. She's also looking at a couple other technologies, one of which involves the microchips we implant in them. If you remember, I said we put radio transmitters in them, but every snake that gets released into the National Forest as part of the project gets a little microchip. It's called a passive integrated transponder, or PIT tag. It's the same thing that people put in their cats and dogs, right? So if it gets lost, a vet can scan it and know, whose pet it is. We do the same thing with the snakes. They're about the size of a grain of rice. Every one we put out there gets one. And then we have a little receiver, and it's got an antenna, and we can put that around this gopher tortoise sparrow, and every snake that goes in and out, it will record that little passive integrated transponder, and allows us to see which snakes are using which burrows and all that sort of stuff. So doing some pretty neat stuff. And of course, the holy grail of any project is to find snakes that were born in the wild, right? It's great if we dump a bunch of snakes out there, but we really want all those snakes that we're dumping out there to kind of make more snakes. That's the whole goal. And just year before last, we met that goal, and we found the first snake that didn't have a passive integrated transponder in it. It was about that big, and it was obviously born out there in the wild to some happy indigo snake parents. And we were maybe more excited than the parents were, because parents just kind of lay the eggs and then they leave. We're like, but it was a very exciting find. It proves that what we're doing is somewhat successful. That was kind of one of the last success milestones that we wanted to reach, was being able to document wild reproduction of our snakes. And we've hit that. So now, we just kind of keep throwing snakes out there and continue to monitor them. So we've been releasing snakes ever since 2010. And we're almost to 200. I think next year we'll top the 200 snake mark. Our early models, because we did some population viability modeling, suggested that we should release at least 300 indigo snakes. And so we're about 2/3 of the way there. A little behind schedule from where we wanted to be. But again, I mean, for a project that involves that many different partners and a really rare snake that's hard to get to reproduce and all that sort of stuff, we feel like we're doing a pretty good job. So again, to this educational stuff, we keep doing a lot of different educational things. One cool thing that we started a couple years ago is the Eastern Indigo Snake and Wildlife Festival that we have every year in the late spring down in the Conecuh National Forest. And we invite the public from all over the state, but especially from the local area. We actually bus in about 500 to 1,000 students, and they're allowed to see indigo snakes as well as other animals that inhabit the longleaf ecosystem. So it's been a very successful program.
That's so much more heartwarming than the rattlesnake rodeo.
Yes, yes, it is. And we actually have rattlesnakes at that festival that we're able to, show the kids. So acknowledgements, I mean, honestly, this is a tiny list. And there are way many more people. I do want to point out a couple of people, Tracy Wood and Carrie Threadgill. Mark Sasser has left his position at the Department of Conservation, and Tracy Wood and Carrie Threadgill now provide a lot of funding and logistical support, and have really carried the project forward and helped us at least from the standpoint of the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. But with that, I'll take any questions if y'all have any. And yeah.
All right, let's get the microphone so our friends on the stream can also hear the question, if that's
Wonderful.
all right.
You're like a celebrity.
You are.
When you were talking about the soft releases and
Yes.
the enclosures, what sort of enclosure do you use to keep in a snake in the woods?
So what we used is, and you could, I didn't have a great picture of it, but basically a hardware cloth fence that's about yay tall, and it's buried about 18 inches under the ground. And we made it pretty much bomb-proof around the outside from the ground up. There's no way an indigo snake could get out. Unfortunately, we didn't think about the underground paths, and small mammals and mice ended up over time making burrows that connected the in and out of the enclosures. And most of the indigo snakes, by the time we were done with the enclosures, had figured out that, oh, I just go down this small mammal burrow and then I pop out on the other side, and then there's this giant world out there. But that's how we did it. Yes.
Thank you so much for what you're doing. This is really wonderful.
Wonderful.
to
Thank
see.
you very much for the praise.
Can you confirm, I didn't understand, how far are they ranging from the release place now over the last 10 years? And the second question is, what about genetic diversity? What are you doing there to ensure that there's a broad gene pool?
I love both of those questions. So as far as the range, the estimates that we have, like I said, that 8,000 acres quickly became about 20,000 acres. And that's kind of where we stopped the radio telemetry. So we know they're using at least that area. They have tended, now that we have more snakes out there, since there's more social opportunities for their snakes, their home ranges have actually somewhat constricted a bit. But they are using a pretty large area. We got a picture sent to me a couple of years ago of one that was hit on a road about 20 miles from the release site. And I really wish I was able to have retrieved that snake. They knew it was federally protected, and so they left it there, sent a picture. It took like 2 days for that picture to get to me, And then I went out there and of course it was gone, but I would like to have scanned that pit tag and seen who it was, where it was released, all that sort of stuff. As far as the genetic diversity, that's a great question. We were very keen, like I said, in the beginning, when we first started getting these clutches of eggs, that's why we held 1 or 2 snakes out of each one. We kind of wanted a male and female. And then during the for the captive breeding program, we got a total of, I think, 29 different clutches of snakes from around southern Georgia. And so we're very careful in the captive breeding program to make sure that, we use a male from this clutch and a female from this clutch, and then they don't get crossbred with any other clutches. So it's pretty complicated. Luckily, I don't have to deal with keeping track of all that. The Central Florida Zoo does, but they have a stud book system like any zoo would for captive breeding. And so that is definitely of high consideration. And again, we tried to capture as much genetic diversity as we could from Georgia, getting snakes from way away from each other.
Did I understand that you have released fewer than 300 snakes?
That is correct. Yes, we have released fewer than 300. We were hoping to have way more than that. But of course, it's pretty challenging to build a captive breeding program. We had originally hoped to release 30 a year for 10 years. Some years we've had as few as 5. Some years we've had as many as 35. But we're not on our target just yet. But hopefully, as the captive breeding program really becomes online and we're able to rear more and more clutches of snakes, we'll be able to reach that target quicker.
Is there a story about the discovery of the first baby, and how many others have y'all actually found?
Yeah, I mean, the story is while we were out during the winter monitoring and just kind of wandering around the sandhills, one of the technicians Vance Wood, who's now in notoriety in the reintroduction group, just stumbled. He just looked down and saw it and snatched. He knew immediately what he had seen and grabbed it up. So yeah, pretty exciting. And what was your other question? So we found one other snake that was a little bit larger, but it didn't have a pit tag. Now, some people might say, well, maybe it just lost its pit tag. None of the ones in captivity that we've ever pit tagged have lost their pit tag. I believe that snake was born in the wild earlier back. They grow pretty quick. It was about a 3 or 4 year old snake. So certainly could have been born in the wild. That's what I like to think and hope. But I guess there's the conceivable chance that it had just lost its tag. But we keep monitoring and keep praying for more. Yeah, Joe.
Have the efforts to increase the gopher tortoise as well as the overall longleaf pine, environment, have they been as successful as y'all have with the indigo snake?
Yeah, I believe so. That's one of the reasons we picked the Conecuh National Forest is because they have been doing a really great job over the last 20 to 25 years at bringing back prescribed fire management, doing longleaf pine restoration and ecosystem work, ecosystem driven work, as well as maintaining and increasing the gopher tortoise population on the Conecuh National Forest. So yeah, the Conecuh Ranger District down there is doing an excellent job with their longleaf restoration programs, which is why we picked that site, because the habitat is vital to the snakes. You can't just throw the snakes anywhere and expect them to live. So yeah, I think it has been. As a whole, Well, we're still facing challenges there outside of the Connecticut National Forest, but they're doing a really good job down there. They just won an award from the Nature Conservancy for their fire program, actually, down there.
Another question here?
I have two questions. The first one is, how do you tell the difference between an indigo snake and a racer? And the
Great.
second one is, are indigo snakes related to ringneck snakes?
They are not closely related to ringneck snakes. They are both in the same family, but they are not necessarily the same. Let's see. So an indigo snake, there's one, actually. There we go. So best way to tell an indigo snake from a racer, one is the size. Indigo snakes are really big. I mean, they get larger than a black racer in the first 2 years. Another thing is, if you notice the red under its chin and around its face, that's very distinctive. Black racers will have bright white chins extending down into the belly. As well as, and it's sort of a subjective thing, black racers have a big kind of bug eye looking eyes, whereas indigos have what I would consider a normal looking eye. But again, that's relative to people that stare at a lot of snakes, I realize, but that's a couple of ways. But yeah, there are both the black racer, the ringneck, and indigo snakes are all colubrid snakes, at least for right now. The taxonomy will probably change here soon. But yeah, other than that, they're not closely related.
Another question right here?
On your
Hold on.
slide about public education.
Yeah.
It looked like a picture of E.O. Wilson.
That is E.O. Wilson. Yeah.
Have you worked with Dr. Wilson in your research?
Not especially. I mean, I've met Dr. Wilson numerous times, and you know, obviously he's kind of a hero of mine, being probably arguably the most famous biologist from Alabama. I have the honor, I will say my one Ed Wilson story is, I had the honor, Ed Wilson's, when he was growing up, his nickname was Snake Wilson, right? Because he had a real passion for snakes. He loved snakes. He spent a lot of time collecting snakes. Well, there's one snake he had never seen, which was the indigo snake. So, you know, my claim to fame is I showed Dr. Wilson his first indigo snake, which was pretty exciting for me and him. So yeah, it was quite an honor. But no, he's a wonderful man, and you know, I can't say we've collaborated as much, but he has brought a lot of attention to the project and to other areas of biological sciences in Alabama.
Yes, sir. I've enjoyed this.
Wonderful.
I have a population of king snakes around my house, and
That's exciting.
I have seen the similar behavior in the king snake that you talked about in the indigo snake,
Mm-hmm.
eating a live cottonmouth
Oh, that's
in my
wonderful.
yard, and I photographed it.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And that was a sight to behold. And I have seen this.
Truly is.
I've seen this king snake skim across my pond rather than swim. He just like he was skimming across the top. And I was wondering, it seems like the king snake is quite related in habits and size to the indigo snake.
They are. They're similar. They're smaller than indigo snake. Indigo snake gets over 8 feet and yay big around.
Wow.
So good bit bigger than a king snake. But they do both eat venomous snakes. Indigo snakes actually have a different way of catching them than king snakes. King snakes, being constrictors, wrap around their prey and squeeze. Indigo snakes have this incredibly powerful jaw, and what they do is they slither up next to the snake, they grab a hold of its head, and they just crunch the head to pulp, instantly killing the snake, and then they swallow it down. So a little bit different hunting strategy. Both awesome snakes. I will say king snakes are seriously declining across their range. So if you have king snakes, that's amazing. save them, love them, pet them. Well, don't pet them. They're a protected species now. Unfortunately, well, fortunately, we protect them. Unfortunately, we had to protect them because they are declining. In fact, in the Conecuh, where we're doing this, king snakes were once the most common large snake species in the Conecuh back in the 1980s. And we were able to document somewhere around the late 90s, 2000s, they just completely disappeared. And all the snake research I've done, thousands and thousands of snakes caught down there. Not one king snake has been documented in the Conecuh. So we've actually been talking about doing a king snake reintroduction program on the other side of the forest, since we're not sure what would happen between a king snake, indigo snake battle. Yeah.
The Great Snake War.
Yeah, it would be kind of like the Great Snake Wars.
What you said about the strength of the indigo snake's jaws leads right into the question I was going to ask, which is how aggressive are these snakes?
Oh, well,
Both in the wild and in captivity.
Well-
That last slide you showed was the only one that even hinted about aggressiveness. The
yeah,
one
and
with the white-
they are, I mean, I can't lie that that is very abnormal shot. That was kind of a wily snake that tended to be more defensive than other snakes. Indigo snakes as a whole, both in the wild and in captivity, are very docile. I've never been bitten by one out of aggression, even after capturing them out of the wild, etc. They're just very gentle snakes, which is one of the reasons that kind of led to their decline, because people often kept them as pet snakes. And so they got collected out of the wild to the extent that it lowered the actual population just for the pet trade. Used to be really popular for people to have them as pet snakes. In fact, burlesque dancers often had indigo snakes as part of their performances. Just throwing that out there. Little known fact, but there's some great old historical photographs of this. Any other questions? Wonderful. Well, thank you all for
Thank you very much.
coming.
A round of applause for Jimmy Stiles.